Brest-Litovsk, Eastern Front, winter 1917. At minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, German and Russian soldiers agreed to a ceasefire not to fight each other, but something else, hunting in the frozen forests. Welcome to the War Maestro's Archive, where tonight we uncover the documented truths that history forgot and the beast that made enemies into brothers in terror. By December 1917, the Eastern Front had devolved into a frozen hell where survival meant more than avoiding enemy bullets. The brutal winter between German and Russian lines claimed more lives than artillery, turning soldiers into skeletal figures who fought as much against starvation and frostbite as against each other. For 3 years, these armies had perfected the art of mechanized slaughter, transforming warfare into an industrial process of death that consumed entire generations. But on December 14th, something unprecedented happened that would never appear in any official military history. For the first time since the war began, German and Russian commanders agreed to a localized ceasefire, not to exchange prisoners, not for medical evacuations, but to hunt wolves together. The telegram that arrived at German high command was so impossible that 3 separate officers verified the cipher before accepting its authenticity. Lieutenant Dietrich Clemens read the dispatch in the candlelit communications bunker, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air that seemed to linger like ghosts of unspoken fears. The 27-year-old intelligence officer bore the hollow-eyed look of Verdun survivors, men who had documented civilization's collapse into mud and blood for weeks on end. At Verdun, he had learned to record the impossible daily, how men continued fighting when artillery had transformed the earth into a moonscape of craters and corpses. But this dispatch challenged even his experience with war's surreal nightmares. Herr Lieutenant, Sergeant Muller's voice carried the particular strain of a man who had witnessed the limits of human endurance. The Russian delegation is requesting an emergency meeting under white flag. They claim their forward positions have been completely evacuated due to wolf attacks. Not abandoned due to tactical considerations, sir. Evacuated because something was hunting their men. The distinction chilled Clemens more than the December wind seeping through the bunker's wooden walls. Evacuation implied organized withdrawal from a superior force. What could make battle-hardened soldiers, men who had survived 3 years of mechanized slaughter, flee in terror from wild animals? Clemens studied the accompanying photographs with growing unease, holding them close to the flickering candle flame that cast dancing shadows across images that defied rational explanation. Russian trenches had been torn apart from within, wooden supports splintered outward, as if something with immense strength had exploded from underground. Bodies lay in grotesque positions, but what disturbed him most was their expressions, frozen in death but somehow peaceful, almost grateful, as if they had welcomed whatever had claimed them. Their hands were positioned strangely, reaching upward rather than in defensive postures, fingers curved as if grasping for salvation just beyond the camera's view. The official Russian report, translated hastily by their overworked Baltic interpreter, spoke of unnatural aggression and pack behavior inconsistent with known wolf patterns. More troubling were the witness accounts from surviving sentries who described bipedal silhouettes moving through the forest with deliberate intelligence, too large and too purposeful to be ordinary predators. One account, scrawled in trembling handwriting, described eyes that held the memory of human thought, but served animal hunger. Within hours, German command had issued orders that redefined the impossible. Lieutenant Clemens was to investigate these claims and establish whether a temporary ceasefire could be arranged with their enemies to face a common threat. The Russian who approached under the white flag moved like a man carrying invisible wounds, each step deliberate and cautious, as if the earth itself might betray him. Alexander Volkov had deserted his unit 3 days prior, crossing the deadly expanse of no man's land with information too valuable for either side to ignore. His face bore the hollow expression Clemens recognized from Verdun veterans, but something deeper haunted his dark eyes, a knowledge that seemed to age him beyond his years. The abandoned farmhouse that served as their meeting point stood like a monument to civilian casualties, its walls pockmarked with shrapnel and its windows long since shattered by artillery. Inside, Russian and German officers sat side by side around a makeshift table constructed from ammunition crates, a scene that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. The shared fear in their faces transcended nationality, creating an uncomfortable brotherhood born from mutual terror. "You're wolves," Alexander said in broken German, his accent thick with Belarusian undertones that carried the weight of ancient forests. "They are not wolves. My grandmother, she knew the old stories before the Tsar's men came to our village. Vechernitsa, she called them. The ones who return when death refuses to keep them." Clemens studied the deserter across the table, noting how Alexander's hands trembled even in the relative warmth of the farmhouse. His uniform bore the stains of hard travel, but more disturbing were the careful repairs to tears that looked suspiciously like claw marks. "Elaborate," Clemens said, his pen poised over his field notebook. Documentation remained his anchor to sanity in this war, facts arranged in neat columns that imposed order on chaos. Alexander's fingers fumbled with a cigarette, the tobacco providing a familiar ritual in an unfamiliar world. Soldiers who die without honor, they cannot rest. The forest keeps them, changes them, feeds on their shame and rage. They return to finish what death interrupted, but they return wrong, hungry for what they lost. He drew deeply on the tobacco, the ember casting shadows across his gaunt features that made him look older than his 23 years. "My grandmother said they hunger not for flesh, but for the warmth of those who still remember being human." Captain Kozlov, the Russian liaison officer, leaned forward with barely contained urgency. "Our forward observation post at grid reference 247, 338 went silent 4 days ago. When we investigated, we found the bunker structurally intact, but completely empty. No signs of battle, no blood, no bodies. Just deep claw marks on the interior walls and uniforms folded with military precision in the corner, as if the men had undressed before simply walking away." The German field reports corroborated disturbingly similar incidents across a 20-kilometer front. Sentries vanishing from their posts without a sound, patrol units reporting shadowy movement in the forest that seemed to mirror their own formations. Most disturbing were the acoustic reports, howls that carried an almost human quality, as if something was trying to remember how to form words with a throat no longer designed for speech. Alexander stubbed out his cigarette with deliberate precision, his eyes never leaving the darkening windows. "In my village, when men went to war, the old women would say prayers, not just for their safe return, but that they would return as themselves. Now I understand why those prayers were necessary." The journey to the forward positions began at dawn, their boots crunching through snow that had claimed more soldiers than bullets in this bitter winter. Each step broke through the crystalline surface with sharp reports that echoed too loudly in the unnatural quiet. Clemens led a mixed patrol of German and Russian soldiers, an unprecedented cooperation born from shared terror rather than diplomacy. The forest stretched before them like a wound in the earth, bare branches clawing at the gray sky with skeletal fingers that seemed to grasp for something just beyond reach. Alexander moved with the careful precision of a man who understood the land's moods, pausing frequently to test the wind direction and study the tree line with predatory alertness. His familiarity with the terrain troubled Clemens, who noted how the Russians seemed to anticipate changes in the forest's character before they became apparent to the rest of the patrol. "Listen," Alexander whispered, raising his hand to halt the column after 2 hours of steady march. The forest had fallen unnaturally silent, as if every living creature had collectively held its breath. No bird calls penetrated the winter air, No small animals scurried through the underbrush that should have been teeming with life seeking shelter. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the branches, creating a vacuum of sound that made their own breathing seem thunderous. They found the first signs, 3 kilometers from the front lines, carved into snow that sparkled with an almost malevolent beauty in the pale sunlight. Massive paw prints tracked across their path, but the pattern defied natural explanation. The gait suggested something that walked comfortably on 4 legs, but possessed the intelligence to rear up on 2 when circumstances required. Each print was larger than any wolf Clemens had encountered, with rear pads that showed elongated toes arranged in a disturbingly human configuration. Sergeant Muller, who had hunted wolves in the Bavarian forests before conscription, claimed his civilian life, examined the tracks with growing bewilderment. His weathered face, normally confident in matters of wilderness survival, showed the confusion of a man confronting something beyond his experience. "Herr Lieutenant," Mueller said quietly, his voice carrying the reverence of a man speaking in a cathedral. "These prints begin as normal wolf tracks, but halfway through this section they change. Look here." He pointed to a section where the rear pads evolved from typical canine prints to something that resembled elongated human toes, as if the creature had been learning to walk upright with each step. The tracks led deeper into the forest, following game trails that wound between ancient trees whose bark bore fresh scars and spiraling patterns. As they followed the path, Private Hoffman began displaying increasingly disturbing behavior. During their brief rest stops, he muttered in his sleep, speaking words in a guttural language none of them recognized. When questioned about these episodes, he claimed no memory of them, but his eyes carried a haunted quality that reminded Clemens of shell-shocked soldiers who had stared too long into artillery barrages. The abandoned Russian trench system revealed horrors that military manuals had never prepared them to interpret. The wooden support beams were shredded from within, as if something with immense strength had clawed its way out of the earth itself, leaving behind splinters sharp enough to draw blood from unwary fingers. The howling ceased abruptly at dawn, leaving behind a silence more unnerving than the sounds themselves. The sudden absence of those almost human voices created a vacuum that seemed to press against their eardrums. Clemens woke to find Private Hoffman standing at the edge of their camp, staring into the forest with vacant eyes that reflected the morning light like polished glass. When approached, the young soldier moved with slow, dreamlike precision, as if underwater. "I dreamed I was hunting," Hoffman whispered, his voice carrying a strange longing that made Clemens' skin crawl. "But I wasn't sure if I was the hunter or the prey." In the dream, both felt the same. His boots were caked with fresh mud and pine needles, despite having been clean when he bedded down. More disturbing were the small scratches on his hands, precise parallel lines that looked deliberately made. Their search pattern led them deeper into territory that maps showed as uninhabited wilderness, but the evidence suggested otherwise. Here, the trees grew denser and more ancient, their trunks bearing spiral scarring that formed patterns too deliberate to be natural. The snow lay undisturbed except for those impossible tracks that seemed to multiply with each kilometer, creating a network of pathways that suggested organized movement rather than random wandering. Alexander moved with increasing agitation, constantly checking their back trail and muttering prayers in his native tongue that sounded more like incantations than religious comfort. His fingers worked nervously at something concealed in his coat pocket, and Clemens caught glimpses of what appeared to be carved bone or antler. The Orthodox chapel appeared through the morning mist, like a fever dream materialized from collective nightmare. Its wooden walls bore deep gouges that spiraled around the structure in patterns that hurt to follow with the eye, creating an optical illusion that made the building seem to breathe. The heavy door hung from broken hinges, swaying gently in the wind with a rhythmic creaking that sounded disturbingly like labored breathing from massive lungs. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of something wild and musky, mixed with the metallic undertone of old blood. They found him crouched behind the altar like a broken animal, naked and catatonic, his body bearing scars that formed intricate patterns across his chest and arms. The wounds had healed cleanly, suggesting they had been carefully made rather than inflicted during struggle. His dog tags identified him as Private Dmitry Petrov, reported missing from his unit 6 days prior. Blood matted his hair and caked under his fingernails, but he showed no visible wounds despite the crimson stains. When Clemens approached, Petrov's eyes snapped open with predatory alertness that belonged to no human expression. He spoke in a voice that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in his chest, the words formed by a throat that had learned to shape sounds differently. "He walks on 2 legs in the day," Petrov said, his gaze fixed on something beyond their perception, "and 4 at night. But the moon tells him which form serves the hunt better. The forest teaches patience to those who listen." Alexander crossed himself and backed away from the altar, his face pale with recognition. "Do not touch him," he warned urgently. The change, it spreads through contact, through blood, through breath shared in close quarters. Once it begins, it cannot be stopped, only guided. They fled the chapel in disciplined retreat, but Clemens knew their organized withdrawal had transformed into something far more primitive. Behind them, Petrov's laughter echoed through the trees, a sound that carried too much intelligence and too much hunger to belong to a madman. The melody of his amusement followed them like a hunting call, rising and falling with an almost musical quality that suggested he was communicating with others in the forest. The landscape seemed to shift around them as they moved, paths they had carefully marked earlier now leading in directions that defied their compass readings. Ancient game trails that should have guided them back to familiar territory instead curved deeper into the wilderness, as if the forest itself was rearranging its geography to serve some malevolent purpose. Alexander's compass spun wildly, its needle dancing in frantic circles before settling on directions that changed with each consultation. Private Hoffman lagged behind with increasing frequency, stopping to examine tracks in the snow that only he could perceive. His breathing had become labored, not from exertion but from some internal struggle that manifested in small whimpers of distress. When questioned about his condition, he spoke of hearing voices calling his name from directions the rest of them knew to be empty forest. "We are being herded," Alexander said quietly, studying the terrain with growing alarm that bordered on panic. "Like sheep driven toward the wolf's den. They are not hunting us randomly or with animal instinct. They are guiding us somewhere specific, somewhere they have prepared for us." The realization struck Clemens with cold certainty as he observed their surroundings. Every path they chose led them deeper into the forest's heart, away from the safety of military lines and toward terrain that felt increasingly hostile. The trees pressed closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block most of the pale winter sunlight, creating a twilight atmosphere, even at midday. Sergeant Mueller was the first to disappear. During a brief rest stop beside a frozen stream, he stepped behind a cluster of ancient pine trees to relieve himself and never return. His rifle lay abandoned in the snow where he had propped it, still warm from his grip and loaded with a full magazine. The only sign of struggle was a set of those impossible tracks leading deeper into the forest, but these were different from the ones they had been following. Smaller, more human-like in proportion, as if something had been gradually learning to walk upright again. Private Hoffman stared at the abandoned weapon with disturbing fascination, his pupils dilated despite the bright snow reflecting sunlight directly into his eyes. "He went willingly," Hoffman said, his voice carrying a dreamy quality that chilled Clemens more than the Arctic wind. "I can smell his relief from here. The fear is gone now, replaced by something else. He remembers what it feels like to be the hunter instead of the hunted." When Clemens grabbed Hoffman's shoulders to shake sense into him, the young soldier's skin felt fever-hot beneath his winter uniform. His pupils had dilated to black circles that reflected light like an animal's eyes, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed sharper than Clemens remembered. Night fell like a predator's embrace, and with it came the revelation that changed everything about the nature of their mission. Private Hoffman collapsed during their desperate march toward the German lines, his body convulsing as transformation accelerated beyond human endurance. Foam flecked his lips as his spine arched at impossible angles, bones cracking and reshaping beneath his skin. But as Clemens knelt to help him, Alexander's hand fell heavy on his shoulder with the weight of terrible familiarity. "Do not touch him now," Alexander said, but his voice carried an intimacy with the process that made Clemens' blood run cold. "The change must complete itself without interference, and then he will understand what I have understood for 3 months, what I learned when I died in the mud near Tannenberg." Clemens spun to face his guide, seeing him clearly for the first time. Alexander's eyes held the same predatory intelligence they had witnessed in Petrov, the same patient hunger that marked all the transformed. His desertion from the Russian lines had not been escape, but recruitment. His knowledge of the folklore was not academic, but personal experience carved into his very soul. "You led us here," Clemens whispered, his hand moving slowly toward his sidearm while maintaining eye contact. "You brought us to them like livestock to slaughter." Alexander nodded with something approaching sadness, the expression of a man who had made an impossible choice and lived with its consequences. "The forest chose me first, Lieutenant. I felt my life drain into the frozen mud during the artillery barrage, felt death claim me as surely as it has claimed millions in this war. But something older than this conflict pulled me back, offered me a choice no military manual ever prepared me for. Return as prey to a world that would grind me into nothing, or return as predator in a world where I could finally hunt those who had been hunting me." Around them, shapes moved through the trees with increasing boldness, no longer bothering to conceal their presence. Former soldiers, German and Russian alike, circled their position with the coordinated patience of a pack that had learned to work together despite years of mutual slaughter. Their eyes reflected the moonlight like scattered stars, and when they breathed, vapor rose from their mouths like smoke from funeral pyres. Hoffman's convulsions ceased, and he rose to his feet with fluid grace that belonged to neither man nor wolf, but something that had learned to master both forms. His uniform hung in tatters, but his bearing carried the confidence of something that no longer feared death because it had already conquered it. "You feel it already," Alexander continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality that seemed to resonate from the trees themselves. "The exhaustion that goes deeper than physical fatigue, the hopelessness that grows stronger with each friend you bury, the certainty that this war will consume everyone you have ever cared about. We offer an end to that suffering, Lieutenant. We offer the strength to survive what cannot be survived." Mueller emerged from the tree line, his transformation complete but his memories intact, still wearing the expression of the competent Sergeant Clemens had known. "I remember everything," he said, his voice carrying both human grief and animal satisfaction. "Every friend I buried in the trenches, every position we lost to pointless orders, every good man sent to meaningless death by officers who never left their bunkers." Clemens made his choice in the frozen silence of that winter night, surrounded by soldiers who had chosen transformation over death. His decision echoed through the forest like a gunshot, final and irreversible. The circle of transformed soldiers waited with predatory patience as he weighed the burden of returning to a war that had already claimed his soul against the promise of strength that could end all suffering. But what that choice was would remain buried in classified files for decades to come. 3 days later, Lieutenant Dietrich Clemens stumbled into German headquarters at Brest-Litovsk, alone and nearly catatonic from exposure. His uniform hung in tatters, bearing tears that suggested encounters with both barbed wire and something with claws. His field journal, found clutched in his frozen hands with desperate intensity, contained meticulous documentation of wolf attacks, missing patrols, and folklore gathered from local sources. The entries grew increasingly erratic toward the end, the handwriting deteriorating from precise military script to desperate scratches that barely resembled language. The final entry, written in what appeared to be a mixture of ink and something darker, read simply, "The forest remembers every soldier it has claimed. We should have left them buried where they fell. Military physicians treating Clemens noted severe frostbite, malnutrition, and symptoms consistent with acute psychological trauma that went beyond typical shell shock. More puzzling were the parallel scratches across his chest and arms, too precise to be accidental wounds but too shallow to be life-threatening. The marks formed patterns that seemed deliberately carved, resembling the ritual scarification they had observed on other survivors of unexplained incidents. When questioned about his missing patrol members, Clemens claimed fragmentary memories at best, insisting he had been alone since leaving the forward positions. His account spoke of wolf attacks and equipment failures, natural explanations for supernatural events. But his eyes carried the same hollow quality they had seen in other survivors who had spent too long in territories the maps marked as safe. The official investigation concluded that Sergeant Mueller and Private Hoffman had deserted to Russian lines, a common occurrence during the harsh winter of 1917 that required no further explanation. The Russian guide, Alexander Volkov, was presumed dead from exposure, another casualty of the brutal Eastern Front winter. The wolf attacks were attributed to starvation, driving normally cautious predators to desperation, a logical conclusion that satisfied military bureaucracy. 2 weeks after his return, Clemens vanished from his quarters in Brest-Litovsk during the pre-dawn hours when sentries changed shifts. Guards found his uniform folded with the same military precision they had discovered at the abandoned Russian positions, his officer's insignia carefully arranged on top like medals on a memorial. The only signs of disturbance were fresh claw marks on the wooden walls that spiraled in patterns too deliberate to be random, and a window left open to the winter night, despite regulations requiring all openings to remain secured. The investigating officer noted that the scratches matched those found at multiple abandoned positions throughout the sector, but this observation was removed from the final report by order of superior command. Officially, Lieutenant Dietrich Clemens had suffered a complete psychological breakdown and wandered into the forest during a moment of delirium brought on by combat fatigue. If this classified report from the War Maestro archive left you questioning what truly stalks the forests of history, then you're ready to join our expedition into darkness. Check the shadows around you, make sure nothing is watching with eyes that remember being human, and subscribe to uncover more buried military horrors. Hit that notification bell, because you'll want to know when our next forgotten file surfaces from the depths of the archive. Share this tale with fellow explorers of the unknown, those who understand that the most terrifying battles were never recorded in official histories. Remember, the forest is still collecting soldiers, and some uniforms are still being folded with military precision.